Good afternoon, everyone. It is a joy to have an opportunity for conversation with each and every one of you. It's been some time since I have been in the capital city. This war against the French and the Indian has been going on for quite a long time, and it has caused a great deal of differences in ordinary circumstances. So it is good to be here with each and every one of you. We've been embarked the past few months, really since June of this year, 1758, until now, December 1758, in an expedition to the frontiers of Virginia and the Ohio Territory. We have made our goal and our effort, under the command of General Forbes, to take Fort Duquesne from the French, once and for all. It's been our goal from the beginning of this conflict, since 1754. So now, finally, 4 years later, after much hardship and much difficulty and much unnecessary challenge, we have finally succeeded in our efforts. Fort Duquesne has fallen. Well, I should say it hasn't truly fallen. The French left before we arrived, burned the place, and left nothing in its place for us to find. But we will take the victory when we can get it. And now, hopefully, Virginia's frontier will come to some semblance of calm for the first time since this conflict began. I realize that perhaps, as I look around, some of you may not be familiar with who I am specifically, so perhaps introductions are in order. Colonel George Washington, formerly Commander-in-Chief of Virginia's forces in this war against the French and their Indian allies. However, currently only one of two colonels in the regiments of Virginia. The first, my regiment, and the second, Colonel Byrd's regiment. I look forward to this chance for a bit of conversation, one with the other, and I hope that I will be able to answer whatever questions you may have. And regarding what has gone on in this conflict, I am well aware that there has been a great deal of rumor and speculation and even frustration with how this war has been handled. And as Commander-in-Chief, formerly Commander-in-Chief of Virginia's forces in this conflict, I feel it appropriate to provide you an opportunity to question me and perhaps hold me to account if necessary on those things. But before we get to that point, a bit of context I think is in order. I wish to highlight to you the importance of several things. One, I wish to tell you of the strength and character which the soldiers of Virginia have done in this conflict in defending you and your homes. Not just those of Virginia, but also Pennsylvania and Maryland and other parts elsewhere. These soldiers, many of them have joined this cause, some with nothing to their name. Some will end this cause with nothing to their name. I'm sure you've read in the gazettes that we have struggled with recruitment from the beginning. It has not been easy to draw soldiers into this conflict for a variety of reasons, but at the beginning of this, we found ourselves oftentimes taking from the, how do I put this delicately? There's no way to put it delicately. The dregs of society. Those individuals who had nothing to their name but their own name. Not even clothes on their back. In fact, many of the men joined without shoes or shirts at their disposal, then hoping that we in the regiment would be able to provide these things for them, which at times we were, but more often than not we were not, which brings me to my second point. As you, I'm sure, are aware that this conflict has not been run as well as it could have been. We have struggled with resources, supplies, soldiers, obviously. Desertion has been rampant. The militia, how to put this nicely? There's no good way to put it nicely. At times has been worthless. At times it has been effective, but mostly it has been ineffective. And in fact, sometimes the opposite of helpful. Many men of our government have lacked the understanding of what goes on in this conflict. Not all, but many. And in many cases, my men, my regiment, my officers, and even myself have been castigated publicly and privately. Sometimes earned, other times not. But all of that to say that the soldiers that I serve with, to my first point, the soldiers that I have served with have continued to carry themselves with dignity, to carry themselves and place themselves in the line of fire. And there are a variety of individuals. Some of them are different than you might expect. They are not all Englishmen. Now, they are all British, obviously, seeing as we are part of His Majesty's Empire, but they do not stand as one distinct group. We have Irishmen, Scotsmen, Germans, Swiss, a few Swedes. We have a few free blacks serving in our ranks. There are many Indian peoples who serve alongside us, not only in the regiments, a few of them, but mostly our allies, the Cherokee, the Catawba, Tuscarora, the Nottoway. men of great connection who have, to be perfectly candid, this last year not been treated as well as they should have been by our superiors, which we perhaps can get into later on. These soldiers, these warriors as well, who have served in this conflict, have put their lives daily on the line. And I am honored to say that I have served alongside each and every one of them. Not just the soldiers or the officers. They have been put through great deals of hardship. And I confess to you, many of them have stood the test of time and become, in my opinion, biased of course, some of the best, if not the best soldiers that the provincial forces of this colonies have to offer. Enough about those circumstances. Perhaps we should turn to the conversation that you wish to engage upon. I do not wish to prattle on endlessly. This is your time to question me about myself, the men, our allies, and the goings-on in the frontier in this year of 1758. So what concerns do you have? What perhaps can we discuss one with the other?
Well, thank you for joining us, Colonel. It's been some time since you've been in the capital city, and indeed we have people who have joined us from all over the country and the world, from Pennsylvania, Virginia, France, Scotland, Kentucky, England, the Ohio territories, all eager to ask you questions and engage in conversation.
It will be enlightening, I'm sure.
Before we get to their questions, we were wondering, do you find that the war is popular?
Do I find the war to be popular? It depends on who you talk to and at what point in this conflict you would ask that question. Just now, the war has not been unpopular, I should say. We have had success this year, mostly beginning with this current conflict with the Forbes expedition to the Ohio, taking of Fort Duquesne, the building of Fort Pitt in its place. Before this point, I confess, no, not very popular at all. There's a distinction that has been made, especially early on in this conflict. There were many people who thought this war being fought over the Ohio territory and being led by gentlemen of note, Governor Dinwiddie, John Robinson, the Carter family, etc. These individuals of great wealth and connection had interest in the Ohio territory. And not to remove myself, and well, not myself, but my family member and others that are connected to me, like the Fairfaxes. And then that is in many ways very true. And there was a distinction made in some minds that this was a war or a conflict that did not touch the common man. And one could make that argument perhaps at the beginning that may have been correct. However, as it has gone on and the conflict has broadened, it has most certainly become a war that touches everyone. The frontier has borne the brunt of this conflict, not the men and women of the East. As their lives have become closer and closer touched, so too the support for the conflict has come. And yet, interestingly enough, the opposite has been true in the East. The more the war happens in the frontier, the less and less support we find from individuals who are not immediately touched by it. Until this year. Although I think perhaps the victories that have been coming this year have helped that endeavor a great deal. It has changed public perception, at least somewhat. That is what I would think on that subject just now.
Colonel, if you wouldn't mind, we have some guests who are very interested to know what the life of a soldier is like in the frontier.
Of course. What is a soldier's life like in the frontier? Well, it is a challenging one. For a good soldier, it depends on where you are posted. Those who are in Winchester and Fort Loudon are closest to their supply line. Their food is more guaranteed. Their pay, not as inconsistent as other places. Their daily lives rising very early, oftentimes depending on what your duties for the day are, before dawn sometimes, sometimes after, depending on what your position is. Being called out and drummed together for service, oftentimes drill. A great deal of drill. We exercise the soldiers as regularly as possible, both in conventional European tactics and in Indian fighting. And those are always constantly being taken care of. Many soldiers work on the Fort Loudon in Winchester, are constructing that, and have been off and on for the past few years. Some of them are sent to be sentries. Some are sent to escort food and ammunition from one place to another. Those are some of the most dangerous assignments. Oftentimes raids and attacks happen just outside our perimeters of the sentries, even as close to Winchester. And individuals are often abducted or attacked very close to the city or the town itself. I shouldn't call it a city. Winchester is barely 60 houses. The further out in the frontier you get, say at Fort Dinwiddie, nearer to Augusta County, a small place with anywhere between 30 to 70 men, depending on the number of troops we have. The life is much more harsh. Not to say that what I just described in Winchester is not harsh, it is. But in those areas, you have no guarantee of resources, and you have no guarantee of supply, of assistance that might come along with it. So you must find yourself steeled every day against the fact that if you are attacked, there is no guarantee that help will come to you at all, or it will take weeks, days perhaps to come. And by the time it arrives, it may very well be too late. So it is challenging. More soldiers die of disease than they do of death to the enemy. We lose more soldiers to desertion than we do to death to the enemy as well. So it is not an easy life.
Thank you for that, sir. Aaron has asked what year you started in the war.
Oh, well, thank you for asking, Aaron. I began this conflict in 1754. My part in it started at that juncture. At the tender age of 22, clearly wildly experienced in the ways of the world. And so my start in conflict began in that year. I found myself, and perhaps you've read about it, Aaron, in the Gazettes about Fort Necessity. I was at the head of a small division of men going out into the Ohio Territory to build a fort, or support the building of a fort at the forks of the Ohio, where Fort Duquesne and soon to be Fort Pitt now stands. And our hope was to control that region before the French could do so. Our allies, the Iroquois in the region, led by a man by the name of Half King, well, we called him Half King, and another, Monongahela, depending on your pronunciation. I'm sure I do not do it justice. They had asked us to, in alliance with the English, to support them in the Ohio as well. And we hoped to have settlement in those regions, open trade with the local peoples, the Shawnee, the Delaware, etc. And the French wished us to not do those things. So it was effectively a race to control the river at that point. The French arrived. Well, we arrived first, not we, but English arrived first, began the construction. The French came, they burned it. I arrived with inferior numbers, and the rest is effectively history. Surrender at Fort Necessity, and then leading to my current command. So my part in this war has been about 4 years in active combat, now that I'm 26. So 22 to 26 years old. Thank you for the question, Aaron.
Thank you, sir. Anita has asked, I understand you have not been in the best of health. How is your health currently?
Anita, you have struck directly to the heart of the issue, I suppose. Thank you for asking after it. It's very kind of you. Well, between us, I do not speak on this publicly very often, so I trust, Anita, that you will keep this between those who are speaking just now. It has not been good. Earlier this year, I was on death's doorstep. I was dealing with the flux, bloody flux, as sometimes the doctors call it, a dysentery. No more description is necessary. Suffice to say, you cannot keep anything in at all. I seemed to have a bout of intermittent fever as well at the same time. I was struggling with consumption of the lungs, very similar to my brother Lawrence's, which took his life. And I started suffering with the flux in August of 57, so over a year ago. And by November of that year, I would to the point where I could not stand, or it was beginning to collapse. And so I was sent home for a time to recover, which took until March of 58, almost 9 months ago now. So I recovered enough to retake my position in the regiment. And I confess, it is not changed much. I still am struggling with the ill effects of that time, and even to this day, I'm dealing with lasting ramifications from those illnesses. But it is enough to be able to stand in front of you and have conversation without support. So do not worry yourselves. But thank you for asking after my health, Anita. It's very kind of you.
Thank you for answering, sir. John has asked if you would consider the attack by the French and Indian force on the Pickawillonie Fort to be the first shots fired in the war.
Would I consider that small skirmish at Pickawillonie out in the frontier, would I consider that to be it becomes, this is where it gets convoluted. The attack on Pickawillonie with the destruction of that group of our allies in that place, and the rumored boiling of one of their chiefs was an aggressive act that cannot be denied. I would be remiss to say it did not play into this conflict. Was it the opening shots in this conflict? I would hesitate to say that myself. I would say personally that the opening aggression of this conflict truly, in my opinion, was the burning of the beginnings of the fort at the Forks of the Ohio in spring of late winter 1754, followed by the incidents at the Glen and then Great Meadows after that. However, the attack at Pickawillany most certainly put tensions on the edge. There were several traders English traders who were being sought after and threatened. The French had begun to round up any English traders that they found in the Ohio Territory. And so I suppose one could say that those were inciting incidents. Would I say the first shots fired? That becomes convoluted because the attacks in the frontier and back and forth, they are ongoing. One war bleeds into the next. So one could almost say that the end of the attack at Pickawillany was not just the beginning of the French and Indian War, but in some ways the end of the War of Austrian Succession, or somehow connected between the two. So complex.
Thank you, sir. Tammy has asked, did you use drill tactics?
Yes, Tammy. My soldiers drill regularly. So drilling tactics, I think the question that you were perhaps asking is what sort of tactics do we employ? European conventional tactics, which you perhaps may be more familiar with as linear tactics, columns, lines, very regimented troop movements, firing in ranks of 3, artillery, cavalry, etc. Yes, my soldiers are trained in conventional European tactics. However, they are also drilled in what some call Indian fighting, and the French call the petit war, the little war. And those tactics are different here than they are in Europe. Now, not to say that there are not light infantry tactics, which is what I'm describing, Indian tactics or light infantry tactics, used in Europe. In fact, England uses them, France uses them, Spain, etc. You must think of light infantry tactics as a tool that is at the disposal of a general. Now in Europe, light infantry tactics may look different than they do here in the frontiers of Virginia. The terrain is different. There are more mountains, there are more trees, there is a difficult complexity in the fighting that goes on that is different than that might be in Europe. So my soldiers are trained both in conventional European tactics as well as Indian fighting, so that if needs be, they can very quickly change from one to the other. We've seen that used to good effect in the frontier. And we've also seen it not used properly, like Braddock's defeat at Monongahela, where conventional European tactics began to be effective, but then when the discipline of the soldiers broke down and fear worked its way into the ranks, they began to break and run. So drill, the continual regimented of these things is necessary to ensure that the soldiers will maintain discipline. And when fear may take them, they do not respond humanly, but respond as a soldier would, which is to ignore the human fear and continue pushing forward. So yes, we do drill quite often.
I think you just mentioned it, Colonel, but Barbara has asked if you would comment on the aftermath of the Battle of the Monongahela and the retreat to Fort Cumberland.
Yes, I'm willing to do that. For those who are not familiar, the Battle of Monongahela occurred in 1755. It was a great force, roughly around 2,000 soldiers thereabouts involved, split into 2 parts. The former column, about 1,200 troops, the rest coming up with the baggage train, separated by some dozens of miles. The advance column was attacked near Fort Duquesne, just crossing the Monongahela River, by, as we know, an inferior force of soldiers and of French soldiers and their Indian allies. The conflict was a bloody one, a brutal one. They targeted the officer corps of the English troops that were there, reducing them into great fear. Oftentimes they would mass together 12, 13, 14 deep. Every time they believed they saw a head or a puff of smoke from the enemy, they would turn as one and fire, throwing away their ammunition. Unfortunately, in the panic, the English troops, the best troops that the world has to offer, oftentimes killed many of their provincial brothers, Pennsylvanians, Virginians, New Yorkers, who had, when the discipline broke down, gone to the trees to fight in their own method, or in a method that would bring them success. I'm convinced that fully a third of our casualties were due to friendly fire. If that does not give you a picture of the conflict itself, I'm not sure what else I can tell you that would give it more weight. But suffice to say, it was horrific. I was given the unhappy responsibility of taking the news back to the second half of the column that we had been soundly defeated, and we're trying to limp our way back to Dunbar and the rest of the soldiers. And myself and a few guides traveled through the nightfall, very little moon. And perhaps what I remember the most is the cries of the wounded in the woods, who had become lost and were wandering about. It was so dark we could not find the path many times. On hands and foot we were moving to try to keep from losing this barely 12-foot wide road that had been discovered, and the screams and shouts in the woods was enough to pierce the heart of adamant. Confirmed even more so by our recent expedition. We traveled the same ground less than a month ago, and my soldiers and the other soldiers with us in this expedition with General Forbes buried some 400 to 450 bodies of those comrades we had left behind, whose bones had been bleaching in the sun for the past 3 years. Some found family members that had been lost. Some did not find what they were looking for. I believe that perhaps is description enough. I'm sorry for speaking on things that perhaps not everyone wishes to hear about. I apologize. Other questions or concerns?
Well, Colonel, I hope that this will not be too personal to ask, but someone has asked if you have experienced exhaustion from fighting, and if so, how are you handling it? And likewise, have your soldiers become overcome in mind and body during warfare?
Oh, yeah. Have I experienced exhaustion? Well, if we are speaking honestly, perhaps one could think that my experience late last year, early in this year, was due in part to the exhaustion of the campaign and the stress involved. Yes, and I readily admit it. And I only imagine that the soldiers that serve at my command, these good men who have in some ways been exposed to more violence than I have in these past 4 years, in some cases, I have no doubt they have experienced the same. I am loath to think that every single desertion that we have is due to cowardice. I am certain that there are some who simply could not stomach it any longer. My officers, there are many who feel greatly the weight of the loss of these past few years. George Mercer lost his brother John, killed outside Fort Edwards about 2 years ago, and that weighs heavily upon him. Colonel Adam Stevens, who's been involved in this from the beginning at Fort Necessity, and since that time, he suffers a great deal. I find that he unfortunately turns to the bottle more often than I think is best for him, but he is struggling his way through it. But yes, no, this war has had an effect on myself, the soldiers, most certainly. And we continue to push on. That is what is expected of us, and that is what we will do. But yes, it would be foolish to think that this conflict would not have an effect on those who engage in it, as well as the people of the frontier. Do not forget those innocents who have been perhaps borne the brunt of this conflict. And the soldiers have suffered, yes, but the citizens, the innocents of these peoples, they have suffered perhaps even more so.
Well, sir, along those same lines, you seem to have an admirer in a young lady named Caitlin, who has commented, "Your courage is well known, as is your ability to think quickly on your feet and rally your men in crisis. From where do you derive such strength and calmness? I'm particularly curious as to how one composes oneself in such a chaotic foray as Monongahela, where you yourself survived being shot at multiple times with bullets through your coat and had horses shot out from under you."
My word, someone has very, very closely been reading the Gazettes. How do I stand firm in those circumstances? I do not think it is particularly unique to me. I learned those behaviors from other officers, from General Braddock, from Robert Orme, from Andrew Lewis, from the other individuals who have served not just in this conflict but in other conflicts like the Jacobite Rebellion, etc. When I stood at Monongahela, I was simply doing my duty. I was not an officer. I was a civilian serving alongside General Braddock's military family, effectively an errand runner for him to ensure that instructions arrive from one place to another. When that conflict broke out, the officers were targeted. Out of the 83 officers involved in the conflict, 69 of them were killed and wounded by the end of it, and many of them within the first 20 to 30 minutes of the battle. So there was very few others to stand in those places. And so, yes, I did do my duty and as best I could to rally the men and stand. But do not think that I was the only one. at that time Colonel Gage, who was himself wounded 3 different times, once in the arm, the leg, etc. He managed to rally his men as well, and he and I and others were the ones who helped the army limp off the field. I am a fortunate individual in that I was not directly wounded in that conflict. There were many others who behaved with just as much bravery as I did, and in fact, one might argue perhaps more so, since they had received such grievous wounds and continued to fight. One of the fellows had his entire chest effectively destroyed, continued to ride back and warned the general of the attack at the front of the column, and then managed to do so in a different language that no one else would understand what was going on. He still is alive today and joining us in this conflict. And so, what brings the bravery? An expectation, duty, responsibility. As an officer, as a leader of men, it is your job to present to the soldiers around you an example that they can follow. In my mind, and in the mind of those who have instructed me, there is no room for anything else. Simply a decision to stand firm, if at all possible.
Thank you, sir. Doug has asked if you could discuss the challenges or mechanics of maintaining ammunition and supplies on the frontier. How far do your munitions need to travel?
You have just perhaps touched upon a very close, very difficult subject. Not well is the true answer. Weapons and ammunition are difficult to keep properly functioning on the field, and provisions and supplies have always been problematic. Anything that comes from the eastern parts of Virginia must travel either from Williamsburg or Fredericksburg or Alexandria, either by water or over land to Winchester. That can be anywhere from 80 to 150 miles. The regions in these areas are not too difficult. There's not much conflict in them, but getting things to Winchester is difficult. For the area around Winchester is heavily threatened by conflict. To move supplies from Winchester to the dozens of small forts and homes all up and down the frontier, which is a line of about 300 miles that is defended, is the most challenging part. I have so few men, well, before this year, I should say, I had so few men in the frontier that I barely had enough men to man the forts, let alone bring supplies one to the other. Food is always a problem. Ammunition and weaponry is even more concerning and difficult. Once it is in the frontier, the weapons and ammunition must be properly cared for. Some do not know how to properly care for it, so that must be taught. If powder gets wet, it depends on how wet it gets, but it becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible to use, or ruined completely. That happened at Fort Necessity. Our weapons and ammunition became laden with water through a heavy rain and were unusable. And that happens quite often. The other challenge that I recently discovered late last year was that one of my quartermasters was stealing goods from myself and the men of the regiment and selling it to the good people of Winchester, to the tunes of hundreds of pounds worth of food, weapons, and ammunition. So not only is the supply lines challenging and difficult, but some places the very soldiers and the citizens that I am protecting and my men are protecting are actively, or have been, not in all cases, but in some, actively working against those who are sworn to protect them. So challenging. Thank you for asking, though, Doug.
Moving on to a slightly different topic. We hope that you will not mind answering this, but Amy has asked if you have any special lady friends currently. Colonel?
There is a certain individual who we have been in several conversations for a few months. Clearly it is known more widely than I thought it to be. So yes, there is a lady in question, Miss Amy. I do confess that there is possibility, I think, lying in that particular place. I probably should. Any other questions on that, or should we just please something else, perhaps, or no?
You can keep talking about her
no,
if you want.
No. She's a lady of quality, of course. Then, one of great respect and kindness, who has condescended to have conversation with me in this regard. We find, I find that, in my opinion, we have a great deal in common. Again, a lady of great quality who is, in many cases, I'm surprised by the fact that she even considers the possibility of union with myself, but that's neither here nor there. And the fact that I have survived this expedition is a good one, perhaps for me, and hopefully for. I haven't seen her since June or May, or a few months ago. So no, yes, that's Mrs. Custis. Is the lady that I'm speaking of.
Well, I suppose that lends itself to another question of, do
Good.
you hope to have a long career in the military?
Oh, no. Not any longer. Thank you for saving me with changing the subject. I find myself at this point moving to a different life. I do not believe that I will have much more of a military career. There was a time where I hoped to join the British regiments as a permanent career soldier serving His Majesty the King of England. The past few years of conflict have taught me that will more than likely not be the case. There's a certain castigation that many British officers and individuals of the English persuasion have by looking down upon provincial soldiers, well, provincials in general. And it is difficult for a provincial officer such as myself to make the jump into regular service with His Majesty's forces. I believe my chances died with General Braddock in 55, so I do not see that career being one that I will carry permanently.
Colonel, we're getting down to our final moments of time with you, even though it's been very educational. And we do have one last question that we hope that you might enlighten us on.
Of course.
Are the rumors that you were considering resigning true?
Well, I think it is an appropriate way to end. Yes, they are correct. My part in this war has been a long one. The past 4 years have brought great hardship to myself, as we've discussed, as well as the soldiers that I serve alongside. My goal from the beginning of this conflict was to serve with honor and integrity and responsibility, things that were drilled into me and taught me by my mother and by my patrons, the Fairfax family. Duty, responsibility, expectation. And that is what I have held from the beginning, service to one's king, one's country, one's family. That's why I joined this conflict, along with the excitement of youth and the desire for fame 4 years ago in 54. In that time, those beliefs have continued moving forward, an expectation of service, of a responsibility to bring protection to the people of the frontier who I am sworn to protect. However, my health and several other things have brought me to the point where I believe that perhaps it is best suited for someone else to take over command of the regiments in Virginia, and whose hopefully their attempts will be met with greater success than mine have been. Personally, I feel that I have not done as much as I should have liked. And the regiment has been successful in certain cases, that is true, but personally, I feel responsible for what has gone on in the frontier. So we took Fort Duquesne, which was my goal from the beginning. Hopefully that will begin to cause the raids in Virginia to cease, and so I believe I can lay down my sword with a certain amount of calm and peace, knowing that I have done what I set out to do so many years ago. So yes, resignation. A private life, hopefully a farmer, a member of the House of Burgesses, which is not terrifying at all. And on the question that Amy asked earlier, perhaps a married man soon. We shall see. That time will tell, and I do not wish to get too far ahead of myself. In all of this, though, perhaps in closing, it would be best to remind you that though I am ending my part in this war, that the soldiers that I have served alongside, our allies, their fight continues. They continue to be engaged in this frontier war, protecting their homes. In the case of our Indian allies, protecting your homes, not their own homes, but their homes are furthest to the south. And I would encourage you to remember that fact, that these individuals of all walks of life have given so much in this past 4 years to defend you and your families. So as my part in it ends, if I can do anything but point you towards their service, and as a member of the House of Burgesses, hopefully support them in their endeavors as well, I will do so, and I encourage you to do the same. I have enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for discussing it with me, and know this, that I am and will remain your humble servant, George Washington. Colonial Williamsburg continues to be supported due to generous donations from people like you.